This is the time of year for church camp. Several of our students have already gone, and I'm sure there are still who still anticipate going before the summer's out. I have great memories of directing church camp for about 16 years, starting in 1988 at Quartz Mountain Christian Camp in Lone Wolf, Oklahoma. I believe it is the hottest place on planet Earth in June and July. Didn't grow up going to church camp, so when I started directing camp in 1988, it was entirely and totally a new experience for me. A lot of my former campers have teens of their own now. It's really fun to see their teens now going to camp on social media. I still have some of my notes from teaching classes at QMCC in the summer, and I look at those class notes from teaching those kids, and I cringe. It's been a long time ago. You think about the things that you said then and think, I don't think I would say that today. Now, no doubt, there was some good content. I think there were some good things said. When you're teaching scripture, you can't hardly go wrong. But yet at the same time, I look back at those notes and I realize I was seriously lacking in wisdom. And consequently, you end up saying things that aren't quite right, things that are probably somewhat lacking in judgment. For example, I recall telling the students, do the right thing. Don't succumb to peer pressure, and everything will work out. Now, that little word of encouragement has three parts to it. Do the right thing, that sounds good. The scripture says the grace of God teaches us to say no to godliness and worldly passion, so that's on the right track. Do the right thing. Don't succumb to peer pressure. And then there's that last part, and everything is going to work out fine. That's really lacking in wisdom, because the truth is, in the short term at least, everything may not work out fine at all. And I'm painting them a very unrealistic picture of the way life is probably going to actually play out. And if the truth be known, likely things could get even worse before they get better. So it especially sounds unwise to say, do the right thing and everything is going to work out. So if I could go back and relive the summer of 1988 or the summer of 1989 with those students, if I could relive those moments, I think what I would do is encourage endurance. Encourage the capacity to persevere, to hang in there, and to make note of the fact that the Christian life is a marathon. It's not a sprint. That would be my word of encouragement for students today. And the other thing that I think I would say, if I was being just really honest and frank with students at church camp, I think I would say, you're not always going to be treated fairly. And you're not always going to be treated justly either. You're going to have experiences in life where you're on the receiving end of unfair treatment, and it really is unjust. So as we think about some of those realities, we're going to continue, as I mentioned a moment ago, in the story of Joseph. And we left off in Genesis chapter 39, where Joseph encountered Mrs. Potiphar, this immoral woman, this wayward wife. Those are very descriptive phrases in regard to Mrs. Potiphar. And I'm going to go on and read Genesis chapter 39, verses 11 through 20 this morning. And this is where we left off last week. Genesis chapter 39, verse 11. One day he, referring to Joseph, one day he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants was inside. She, referring to Potiphar's wife, she caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. Now, I realize we don't know what that looked like, but I have this sneaking suspicion he ran as fast as he could. In verse 13, when she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and had run out of the house, she called the household servants. "Look," she said to them, "this Hebrew who's been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." She kept his cloak beside her until his master came home. Then she told him this story. "That Hebrew slave that you brought to us came to make sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." When his master heard the story his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me," he burned with anger. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was in prison, the Lord was with him and showed him his kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. One writer who's reflecting on the book of Genesis has these observations in regard to the events that have just been described here in Genesis chapter 39. Here's what he says. He says, Potiphar was left with the unenviable choice of siding with a slave and exposing his wife as a liar, or getting rid of Joseph. He chose the latter, of course, though the fact that he merely had Joseph thrown in prison suggests that he did not entirely believe his wife's story. The normal punishment for such an offense would have been immediate execution. This writer goes on to say a harder temptation may have come to Joseph. The temptation to feel abandoned by God. After all, he had done the right thing. He had resisted temptation, but the Lord, far from protecting him, stood by and let a great injustice be done. Where is God when you really need him? We'll come back to that thought here in just a moment, but just one quick observation before we move on. It really is an unrealistic expectation for us to think that things are going to immediately work out when we choose to do the right thing. That things are going to immediately fall into place or work out in such a way that we just think, oh, I've been blessed, everything's great, everything's wonderful, and life's going to go on just the way I had planned. So that being said, there is one clear message in the story of Joseph that again surfaces as Joseph sits in an Egyptian prison. In verse 23, back to Genesis chapter 39, in verse 23, the warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. I'm sure all of us, every single person in this room can relate to a situation where circumstances did not immediately work out because you did the right thing or when you made the right choice. And yet, despite how we perceive our circumstances, despite how we perceive our very life at that moment, God's presence is a reality. Can I repeat that? in our life too, God's presence is a reality. God does not abandon you. Wherever you find yourself, in whatever set of circumstances you find yourself, God does not abandon you. When you are in your own Egypt, or you have the experience of Egypt, as I've made reference to the last couple of weeks, God does not abandon you. He is with you. He is with you today. He is with you at this very moment. And if there's one lesson that is central to the Joseph story, it's that God uses things that he hates to accomplish the goals that he loves. I probably better repeat that. Let me repeat that one last time. Let me say it very slowly. If there's one lesson that's central to the Joseph story, it's that God uses things that he hates to accomplish the goals that he loves. So let's look at that in the context of Joseph's story. God hates disunity. God hates favoritism. God hates greed and deceit and immorality. He hates all the above. And oh yes, by the way, Joseph experienced all of the above. Joseph was on the receiving end of his brothers' hate and their deceptive behavior. Joseph was on the receiving end of such things because his father ultimately was responsible for the atmosphere of favoritism that was created in their family. And yet, for those of you who know the rest of the story, if you don't know the rest of the story, that's great. We'll get there in a couple of weeks. Ultimately, in the big picture, God will use Joseph in ways that he would have never possibly imagined. And God's purposes are going to prevail despite all of the evil things that have occurred. I've been using Romans chapter 8, verse 28. I've told the church over the last several weeks, it's one of those passages that's looking over our shoulder. As we read the Joseph narrative, Romans 8:28, it's just looking over our shoulder through all of Joseph's ups and downs. We know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, and the key phrase is, who have been called according to his purpose. So it's possible at this point that Joseph could not see or grasp what God was doing in his life, and yet he continued to trust and live for the Lord. And much, much later, we're not there yet. It's going to take us a couple weeks to get there. And later, in looking back over his life, he was able to see God's purpose in all of it. That throughout all of his ups and downs and all of his life experiences, ultimately, God's purpose was prevailing. And much later in Joseph's life, he will discover that God indeed uses things that he hates to accomplish the goals that he loves. So when I return to this series 2 weeks from today, we'll uncover that very truth as the story continues. In fact, it's going to take me 3 weeks. We've got 3 more weeks to go before we get to Genesis chapter 50 and the whole story is told. So on the 18th of July, the title of my lesson will be, I had not planned on leading an entire country. So as we conclude this morning, just a few challenges. I'm not going to use the word invitation this morning. I want to use a stronger term. I want to use the term challenge. I want to challenge you to go on and read Genesis chapter 41 in anticipation of our time together 2 weeks from today. And furthermore, I'd like to challenge and, yes, invite you to take some further action following our time together this morning. That's this. To reflect on some thoughts for further reflection. Here's some thoughts to think about over the next couple of weeks. Have you done the right thing recently? Have you made some choice? You've made some commitment. You just know in your heart of hearts, I did the right thing. I'm curious this morning if in your recent experience, if you've done the right thing and things actually got worse. Maybe it got much worse. So my challenge for you this week, or really over the next couple of weeks, what does trusting God look like for you at this moment in this chapter of your life? What does trusting God, taking your life and entrusting it to Him, what does it look like for you? Are you in a waiting period? A waiting period where, as the psalmist says in Psalm 37, verse 7, be still before the Lord and wait patiently for Him. And the psalmist also says, do not fret when evil people succeed in their ways, when they carry out their wicked schemes. Maybe you're in one of those waiting places where you have to be still before the Lord and wait for Him. When you do the right thing, life may get worse before it gets better. So the word of encouragement I would have for us this morning is to encourage you to endure, to hang in there, to persevere. That's what I should have told those students in 1988 at Quartz Mountain Christian Camp. As I look back at those pictures and I was wearing a pair of red Chuck Converses. Boy, those are some neat Converses. And I think I must have weighed all of 150 pounds standing there dripping wet back in those days. And I think, wow. And there was no gray hair back then. Funny how all that changes. So what I wished I had said to those students, the scripture says, perseverance must finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. James chapter 1, verse 4. Who can you encourage this week? Who's falling down? Who's struggling to hang in there? I'll look forward to being back with you by tonight around 7 o'clock. I'm flying to Milwaukee and spend a week in Wisconsin, and I'm kind of disturbed. It's going to be hot there today. They're going to have a high of 80 degrees today. I hope you're feeling really sorry for me, and I will think of you and bless your heart as I look at the weather over the course of the week and look forward to being back with you, Lord willing, 2 weeks from today. Let's stand and sing our invitation song this morning.